Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to a 16-year-old runaway named Kathleen Maddox. Maddox was what Manson referred to as a street child, a small-time criminal with a record. Soon after having little Charles, she would marry William Manson, whose only lasting effect would be the changing of Charles's last name. Having escaped a strict, religious family, Kathleen was more interested in sex, trouble, and heavy drinking than looking after her son Charles. Almost constantly neglecting her child, Kathleen would begin the theme of rejection that would characterize most of Manson's life. It is said that on one occasion, Kathleen sold her son to a waitress at a local diner for a pitcher of beer, only to be recovered by his uncle days later.
My mother went to prison for 5 years for strong-arm robbery. Her brother had to deal a trick in off the street and put the yoke on him to get some money to eat.
Eventually, Kathleen would find herself in prison after a local robbery gone wrong, and Manson would be shuffled around different relatives in West Virginia. The future killer would live with an uncle who later committed suicide, another who abused him for being too feminine, and another somewhat stable yet extremely religious home. It is possible that the rejection from his mother, then later his relatives, would make Manson feel inadequate, thus having to overcompensate as an adult. The rejection became concrete in 1947 when Kathleen was released from prison. At the request of a boyfriend, she put Charles into a foster home.
The only thing my mother taught me was that everything she said was a lie. And I learned never to believe anyone about anything.
Manson again would be shuffled around, this time different foster homes, most of which he'd escape from and get into more trouble. At the different reformatories he would be labeled as dangerous and antisocial. At the age of 19, having spent most of his youth in reformatories, all Manson knew was crime. It wasn't long before he broke his parole by forging a check and was sentenced 10 years in prison. Fortunately for the young Manson, prison felt like home. Returning to a familiar environment, it was here Manson would share a cell with known gangster Alvin "Creepy" Karpis, who would teach the man to play steel guitar. His passion for music would play a key role in the murderous events that would take place in his future. Released from prison in 1967, at the height of the hippie movement, the shaggy-haired, bearded musician fit right in. Due to his charisma, charm, and philosophical ramblings, it wasn't long before Manson had formed a following.
He said, "So your father just kicked you out of the house?" And that started it.
Lynette "Squeaky" Fromm would become one of Manson's most passionate and most dangerous followers.
And we talked on a number of levels. His mind intrigued me.
Charlie was what he needed to be at any given time.
With Fromm, Manson moved to Southern California with a handful of men and women who viewed him as no less than a hippie guru. Having never had a real family, Manson was quickly forming one of his own. What happened when Manson arrived in Southern California would set into motion the events of the future. Drummer of the Beach Boys, Dennis Wilson, returned to his California home one night to find the Manson family inside. Initially frightened, he eventually hit it off with Charles when Wilson heard Manson's music. For the next few months, the Manson family lived with the Beach Boy until his manager had kicked them out. Manson carried a bitterness with him when record producer Terry Melcher, who he had met through Wilson, promised him a record deal, then ceased contacting him. Once again rejected and without a home, Manson would relocate to Spahn Ranch, an abandoned movie set in Southern California. Here he began encouraging his followers to take heavy doses of LSD, after which he would exploit their insecurities and fears, further tightening his grip on the family.
He also used drugs very effectively. Marijuana and LSD were the main drugs he used. Manson went on many LSD trips with his family, sometimes 2, 3, 4 a week, either taking no LSD himself or a smaller dosage than they would to retain more control over his mental faculties. While they were on these trips, he would dig down deep into their psyche and try to remove their long-standing convictions on life. If I were to single out the most important way that he got control over these people, was simply preaching to his family on a day-to-day basis in an isolated setting. The isolation of the setting is very, very important.
Sometimes he would reenact the crucifixion when we were on LSD, and it was very realistic.
It was during this time Manson began preaching his most infamous dark prophecy, Helter Skelter.
When I get to the bottom, I go back to the top of the slide. Where I stop and I turn and I go for a ride. Till I get to the bottom and I see you again. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Believing that the Beatles had written a hidden message into the song on the White Album, Manson preached that there was an impending race war between blacks and whites, and the blacks were going to rise up and destroy all the whites. Unfortunately for Manson, the war never happened. When his followers questioned him why, he said it's because the Manson family needed to give the blacks an example of how to kill the whites.
So on the late afternoon of August the 8th, he told his family, now is the time for Helter Skelter. Tells Tex Watson to go to the former home of Terry Melcher, Doris Day's son, murder everyone on the premises. Tells the girls, get some dark clothing and a knife, go with Tex, do everything that Tex tells them to do. And that night, as you well know, Sharon Tate and 4 other people were brutally murdered, stabbed to death. 3 of the victims were also shot.
Sharon Tate, wife of director Roman Polanski, had been 8 months pregnant at the time. Helter Skelter was written on the walls in her blood.
If you're gonna do something, leave something witchy. Just like I would tell you, if you're gonna do something, do it well. And leave something witchy. Leave a sign to let the world know that you were there. Have a good day.
The following night, Manson decided it was time to strike again. This time they went to 3301 Waverly Drive, the neighboring home of a party the family had attended the previous year. The target was a married couple named Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. The same 4 who attended the previous murder, as well as 2 new family members, broke into the LaBianca house and tied the couple up using lamp cords and put pillowcases over their heads.
All I remember is staring into that room. And then Tex turned me around and handed me the knife, and he said, do something. Because Manson had told him to make sure that all of us got our hands dirty. And I stabbed Mrs. LaBianca in the lower back about 16 times.
The scene was once again gruesome. Continuing with the theatrics of writing on the walls and the victims, the community was shocked, and Hollywood was in a state of fear.
And so a lot of the high-profile Hollywood stars, apparently Sinatra left town. Tony Bennett was living at the Beverly Hills Hotel in one of the bungalows. He moved inside to be safe. Steve McQueen supposedly drove around with a gun in the front seat of the car now, all reacting to the Sharon Tate killings.
With the police dumbfounded, it seemed Manson was going to get away with the perfect murder. Unfortunately for him, family member Susan Atkins, jailed in LA for another crime, bragged to cellmates about the family's killing spree. The following day, the Manson family was arrested, and Manson was put on trial for first-degree murder. The trial shocked the nation and was watched very closely in households across the country. Having his request to be his own attorney shot down, Manson's next move was to make it very clear on how much control he exercised over the family. Manson ordered the girls to show up to the courthouse demonstrating bizarre behavior, such as shaving their heads, singing, drawing X's on their foreheads, and always with a smile.
By Charlie, every day we'd meet, and he'd decide, well, today I want you each to stand up and hold your hands in some stupid symbols. You're going to get up and scream.
Although difficult to try Manson, seeing as he never directly murdered any of the victims, Manson was eventually sentenced to death after a family member, Linda Kasabian, turned over state evidence. However, California Supreme Court would eventually outlaw the death penalty, and Manson's sentence was changed to life in prison. Still alive and in prison today, Manson will occasionally come up for parole hearings, however is always denied. Earning the reputation as one of the most notorious psychopaths, whose antisocial behavior and extreme narcissism supports this belief, Bugliosi argues otherwise.
He's not insane at all. You cannot confuse his being morally bizarre, tainted, twisted. You cannot confuse that with insanity. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had not lost contact with reality. He's able to distinguish and assess his weaknesses and his fears. He's not crazy at all. He's very evil. He's a very evil, sophisticated con man, but he's not insane at all. He knows exactly what he's doing.
One thing is for sure, Manson's horrific cult will long be remembered, and many will wonder the same question.
Tell me in a sentence who you are.